Yes.
Thank you. I heard in the original presentations from the Honorable Miss Dudley that she kind of was uncomfortable with, she didn't use these words, but sort of the nanny state where government decides for us. And I guess I've lived long enough that I remember how smoking in public places was debated. I guess everybody in this room is old enough for that. And certainly when those rules against smoking in restaurants and so on first came along, there was an awful lot of talk about how it was nanny state. And now that it's more established, I wonder if we were, you were talking about retroactive analysis. You know, how do you take that regulation in your considerations of cost-benefit analysis and in your distaste for the nanny state? I hope I haven't mischaracterized your position. Excuse me. Thank you.
Well, I really hate secondhand smoke, so I'm one that I don't like secondhand smoke. But I found, and I live in Virginia, which I think required the federal government to say you can't smoke. And yet I found restaurants, and I chose restaurants that had sections, non-smoking sections that actually you could breathe clean air. You know, some restaurants used to have non-smoking sections right next to the bar, and so you still. Even something like that, where I personally think I've benefited, it's not clear to me that it was necessary for the government to do. And one little observation on that: one of the things I think often with regulations, we always start with good intentions. But then there are often unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences that I've noticed from that, because I was never, you know, I avoided smoke at all costs. Now when I walk down the street, I'm exposed to smoke when I wasn't before, because the only place you can smoke is on the sidewalks. So now I think, so it's not clear to me that, I think that there were unintended consequences.
I would tell you that in New York, they don't allow you to smoke around the entrance to buildings just to prevent it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead. If you had
no, I have something else to come back to, though.
Okay.
If no one else has questions.
One, I think, really interesting kind of issue that your question raises is whether you look at the kind of preferences before or the preferences after the regulation. And this actually comes up in the smoking context. Is quite interesting because you have seen a big, I mean, I'm from New York, and so you've seen a really big shift in people's preferences, whereas if you had done the cost-benefit analysis beforehand, you know, it might have disfavored the rule. Business owners actually were really worried about the rule. But afterwards, really, you've seen this massive change in preferences, and business owners love the rule, actually, because there's been an uptick in restaurant and bar attendance because people don't really like secondhand smoke. It's kind of gross. And so, but that does raise an interesting question, because there's not any reason to actually prefer one over the other in terms of, is it before or is it after? What is the relevant point for evaluating the rule? And it's actually not clear that there's any kind of a priori answer to that question. Typically, we do it before, that we use the ex-ante set of preferences to evaluate rules. We don't try to predict what the preferences are going to be in the future and then use those to evaluate the rule, although that is something that we could try to do if we thought a rule was going to have big preference kind of changes. This actually comes up in the fuel efficiency context because it may be the case that there's a preference shift once you institute stricter fuel efficiency standards, because people's what they care about in terms of their vehicles isn't necessarily actually having kind of bigger cars or having bigger engines or more horsepower. It's actually having more horsepower than the other guy. And so if you actually shift the whole marketplace, it's not clear that you're harming people. So anyway, that is a very interesting kind of technical issue.
Has there been sound empirical work done on that?
Yeah, no, there is empirical work on that. The standard empirical kind of test that you use on that particular thing with the cars is people's happiness with their cars and then horsepower over time. So people have kind of, their happiness is correlated with their horsepower of their car vis-a-vis the market, but then as the market shifts, they don't get any happier. So horsepower has been going up, but people haven't been getting any happier with their cars. It's just that the people with more horsepower tend to like their cars more than the people with less horsepower in their cars.
And besides, hybrid cars actually have quite a lot of horsepower. I'll tell you, we can. Don't try to beat me when I'm at a stop sign in my Prius.
A question about the cost-benefit analysis. Either in the cases that analyze where it's been used or in the statutes as they come from Congress, do you see an attempt to grapple with the Hayekian economic issue of information and timing? You have to analyze the problem, you have to figure out a solution, how to address it, you have to process what you get, you have to actually implement it, and then you have to go back and figure out if it made sense. And in a world of Twitter and instant information, I'm not sure that the federal government in a land of 300 million plus people can actually adequately address that timing issue. And I'm wondering what you're seeing when you analyze the cases.
Is this a question for lawyers, whether they see Congress recognizing it when they pass new regulatory statutes?
Yeah, when an agency says we would like to do X, for example, in Washington State, Region 10 EPA, and maybe this is the message from the Obama administration, EPA Region 10 in Seattle is saying that the water flowing across the state line from North Idaho to Washington must meet a phosphorus standard that is unachievable technologically, okay? And the Washington Department of Ecology, which it's really named that, is mandating that this standard be put in place, and there's absolutely no way for Idaho in any way, shape, or form to afford this because, number one, they don't have the money, but number two, the technology does not exist, and everyone understands that. But it's still coming down the pike. Now, this is not a solid rule yet, but this is the message that we're getting. And I'm just seeing a massive disconnect between what the agencies would like to do, say in an ideal world, under the Clean Water Act, I guess in this case, and their ability to actually process a cost-benefit analysis. And I just don't see the timing issue. I guess I'm looking for the incentives that he talked about. Maybe we should just incent people to actually invent these things to solve the problems rather than try to, figure out the cost benefit of doing tomorrow's work.
Right. And I think that at the end of your question, you have the answer, which is the way I see kind of Hayek's work influencing cost benefit analysis. Because so the critique at some level is that it's basically impossible for the government to process this information on an ongoing basis. There's just too much. The economy's just too big. It can't be done. And that's, I think people take that criticism. And the idea is to, but that comes up more in the context of instrument design than cost benefit analysis, I think. So the kinds of instruments that you're talking about, a cap, a tax, where you're actually kind of creating incentives for economic actors to do the right thing rather than trying to say command and control, regulate the entire economy, which just is, for informational reasons, basically impossible. You do the cost-benefit analysis on these kinds of instruments that can engage the economy and can push information out into the economy, because that's what you do when you internalize a cost, right? Say your pollutant has a social cost, you internalize it, that pushes information into the economy that then changes the shape of innovation going forward.
Yeah, I've just been reading a lot of Hayek recently, and it's, at least in the parts I've been reading, he doesn't address externalities head on. It does seem to me that his argument overall suggests that government is likely, in selecting a tax, a prohibition, whatever, to be wildly off. But he, which probably a lot of people in this room would agree with, but he does not set out to establish that where there are serious externalities, the huge government error is necessarily worse than what the unadjusted market would produce.